Welcome to our tour of classic cameras through the decades, and in this video we're looking at the 1980s, and we're dividing the 1980s into two parts because it was quite a big decade in terms of camera technology. So in this video we're looking at the early 80s, and we're with John Wade, our classic cameras expert, and he's going to talk us through the cameras from the early 1980s. John.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, Nigel. Well, the thing to remember or know about the early 1980s is it was a time when, for various reasons, camera sales began to fall off a bit. And there were a few reasons. In the amateur sector, I suppose, rather than in the professional sector. And really, it was down to the fact that cameras had almost become too clever for their own good. So the natural route for an amateur photographer would perhaps have a basic compact and then upscale to a better compact or go the SLR route. What happened was, because cameras had become so clever, that amateur photographer would get his basic compact and think, well, there's no point in upgrading because I've got everything I want there. I mean, there's a perfect example. It's a Pentax Zoom 70. That was the first compact with a zoom lens. So it was getting to the point where all they wanted was a pentaprism on top and they'd have an SLR. So for that reason, sales of compacts began to fall off. Another reason was as they moved up from compacts to SLRs, they encountered SLRs which were becoming very complicated, and a lot of amateur photographers with their compacts got a bit scared, so they didn't upgrade in the way they had done in the past. And for that reason, sales of SLRs began to fall off. So what the market needed was a new type of camera which would appeal to that sector of the market who wasn't upgrading like they thought they were to. And various companies tackled it in different ways. Canon did a treat with a T series of cameras which started in the early 80s and began to progress through it. And they started off with this one. This is the Canon T50. And basically what we've got here is a camera which has got all the advantages of a single lens reflex insofar as it's got interchangeable lenses and it's got reflex viewing, but it's got the simplicity of use of a compact. And so basically it's a programmed mode exposure and very little else. And the person who had been using a compact, perhaps wanted an SLR, was scared of SLRs, went for this. So they got an SLR with the advantages of an SLR, but with the simplicity of use of a compact. And that was the T50, which Canon started off with.
Right, okay. You see there's almost there's no buttons, there's no dials or anything to press.
As you can also see, a very different style of camera as well. It's not very attractive compared to some of the cameras.
It does have this is the 80s without being told, don't you?
Yes, absolutely.
The thing that I find a bit confusing is because earlier cameras, if you were a photographer in the 60s or 70s, they were all complicated. There was no automation. They were all, you had to know how to do it. So I wonder what was complicated about from the 70s. Is it because they'd got used to very automated compacts?
I think
they
that's
didn't
it.
have that, did they?
I think that's it. And you get, for instance, just to sidestep slightly, if we take a camera like the Nikon FA, this was, well, in my opinion, only one of the nicest cameras that Nikon ever made. And they made this in 1983. But it's a typical sort of camera which would have scared someone who had an all singing, all dancing compact.
Yeah.
But here you've got a camera which, for the first time from Nikon, had the main 4 exposure modes. Right. It was the first camera ever with AMP metering. It's a beautiful, really, it's a lovely camera. But it's the sort of camera which would have scared that particular branch of the market.
Right.
And
but I guess 10 years earlier, maybe wouldn't have done, because
yes,
even compact cameras had those dials.
Exactly,
as well.
exactly. So, and as a consequence, I don't know if it was a direct consequence, the FA, a beautiful camera, but it never really took off. It
was my first Nikon.
Yeah, I remember you saying
was,
before how much you liked the FA.
Yeah, it was a great camera, and I wish I'd never sold it. I sold this and got an 801, which is one of their early autofocus, 35 minutes long. No one remembers that camera now, but the sort of these 80s Nikons, I've still got the FM2, which is obviously the pure mechanical version without the automatic modes, but it's essentially a very similar camera.
Yeah.
This is great.
Yeah.
Whereas this is, as you say, a point and shoot with interchangeable lenses, isn't it?
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
So they went on from that to try and make something a little bit more sophisticated. If I take the lens off, because I haven't got a lens on the next one up, they then came up with, pretty sharpish, the T70. And this is a little bit more clever, because this has got, it's still got the programmed automation, but it's got various other exposure modes, etc.
So they added more program modes, I guess.
Yes, it added more program modes. It added a wide program mode and a teleprogram mode.
So it's still automated, but there are different programs for different types of...
Exactly, but it probably wouldn't frighten people so much, so they could progress to that.
Right.
So that's the T50 and the T70. The next one was the T80, completely different. This was one of the very early autofocus cameras. And as with most autofocus cameras, as we'll discuss in a further video, all the automation for the autofocus was actually in the lens, but it's still an FD mount. So basically, you've got a T70 with the addition of 3 autofocus lenses, of which this is one. This is the standard lens, but a very different way of looking at things. I don't know why they progressed that way, but that's what they did.
So the first iterations of autofocus, the AF was in the lens, the motor was in the lens.
Oh yes.
So you have this big hump on the lens.
Yes,
right?
we've got all this on the side, you see here. Now from there, they abandoned autofocus and went for the T90. So if we put a lens on it, we've got one of Canon's nicest cameras, I think. And it was made under the influence of a German designer called Luigi Colani, who designed this. And I think, as you mentioned earlier when we were speaking, it very much dictated the way Canon SLRs would go in future days, right through the EOS range, right through to digital cameras these days.
It's one of the most influential cameras ever, isn't it?
I think it is.
As I said before, even the most recent cameras just launched, like the R1, still kind of look like that.
Yeah.
Different versions of it. So this was, what year was this?
This was about 84, 85, something like that, I think. Yeah.
So that was like a landmark in terms of camera design, because not just Canon EOS cameras look like that, but a lot of DSLRs look like that now.
Yes, yeah. But when you consider they started off with that, and they ended up with that, they were changing their mind as they went along, as you can see there. Now the interesting thing is, and I've got no answer for this question, you might have noticed I went T50, T70, T80, T90, no T60.
Okay.
No, but they did produce a T60.
They did.
Much later, which is this one. I won't bother to put the lens on it. And it's just a bog standard SLR made for Canon by Chinon. And
it doesn't look like a Canon, does it?
No, not at all.
So this was this for like emerging markets or sort of budget? It's obviously a very budget or a student camera or something.
Absolutely, yeah. So they must have had a sort of a last minute panic there.
Yeah. Maybe they saw a gap in the market that... I mean, it could be that, I don't know, the FM2, which was a popular camera, purely basic camera for students and things, that was selling a lot, and they thought, we need one of those.
Yes, absolutely.
But it's not any...
But why do they call it a T60? Why did they leave the 60 out between the 50
I'm
and
sure
70?
there'll be somebody out there watching this video who knows all about the history of Canon that can tell us
about
the T60.
We shall hear.
But the T90 though, I remember when that came out, it was a very Marmite camera, wasn't it? Because cameras kind of look like this.
Yes.
When that came out, a lot of people just absolutely hated it, didn't they? It was a real, people either loved the space age, wow, this is really futuristic, or they thought, what on earth is that?
Yes.
I don't want anything to do with it.
Yes, absolutely. It did have a fault. It did have a nasty habit of throwing up an error message.
Right.
And the only way to cure that was to give it back to Canon and say, could you mend this, please?
Right, okay.
And I had one many years ago that developed that fault, and Canon repaired it. And they gave it back to me, and a week later it happened again, and I sold it because I felt I couldn't trust it.
Yeah.
And I've heard a few people say that.
The other thing about it, of course, is as well as the sort of the curvy styling, that the basic hand grip, built-in hand grip, and built-in like motor drive.
Motor drive as well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
This is the style of,
it's a very comfortable camera to use.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, when I was using it, I liked it very much.
Yeah.
Until the time it threw a fault at me. So basically, when I then later became a collector, I had to have one because of the camera it is. And I remember seeing one for sale at a camera fair, and the dealer said to me, "Oh, you can have that for 50 quid." And I said, "Well, actually, I only wanted to illustrate an article, so I want a broken one." And he said, "I've got one of those at home."
Oh, really?
So that's a broken one. It does work occasionally. If you put a battery in it, it'll work once, and you take the battery out and put it in again. But so they were a little bit temperamental. The other direction that a few other camera manufacturers went in was with the bridge camera, which sort of bridged between the compact and the SLR. And this really started towards the end of the 80s and went through to the 90s.
Well, into the digital era as well, really.
Absolutely. Well, there are digital bridge cameras, just as there were APS digital cameras.
Yeah.
So again, I'm sure it was only to sort of try and invent a new market. So that a Chinon Genesis, with a name like that, had to be one of the first. They were ugly looking cameras. But basically, it is an SLR, non-interchangeable lenses, of course, but with all the automation you want, a built-in motor drive, the various shutter speeds, apertures, program mode. And that was one of the first bridge cameras.
It is ugly, isn't it?
Yeah, it is quite ugly.
I guess it's people who wanted a long lens. They wanted a compact camera, but the lens wasn't long enough in a compact camera. So they wanted a long lens version of that, didn't they?
I think there was a feeling that, yes, I want a new type of camera, but I just don't want an upgrade on what I've got that doesn't give me any more.
Yeah.
I've normally got, so.
Yeah, 35 to 80.
And there were quite a lot of these right into the 90s. Perhaps one of the better ones was this. This is the Ricoh Mirai, which was used very much like that, and built-in flash which pops up there.
I mean, it's enormous. If you look at it's a big old beast, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But it was sold with various accessories. I've got a data back for it, all sorts of things. I don't know, I suppose they must have thought this might have been the way forward. But don't forget, this was very much a transitional period.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say digital was there yet, but it was up there on the horizon. You know, the very first digital camera was in 1975, so they must have known that this was coming.
Yeah.
And this and things like the APS cameras, which we've dealt with elsewhere, was a last-minute ditch bid to try and keep film alive. But they are the bridge cameras, and they lasted through into the 90s.
Which one is it? This is.
That's a Chinon Genesis.
So that's a 35 to 135. So that's actually when you look at it that way, it is bigger than this. But this is only 35 to 80, and this is actually 35 to 135, which is a significantly longer lens on it.
And I think there was a lens converter you could slap on the front to make it even longer. It's probably quite a nicer looking camera than the Genesis.
But people that like the sports and wildlife, I mean, the 135 still isn't massively long, but probably for the time it probably was pretty long in terms of a built-in lens. Yeah. That's amazing.
So that basically is the way the market sort of reacted to the fact that they needed a new type of camera in the 80s.
Yeah.
But of course, coincident with that, coming along beside it was autofocus, which we touched on briefly with the T80. And I think in a future video we can look at in a little bit more detail.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good introduction to that transitional period between the sort of this style of, which was the traditional style of camera up until the early 80s, into this period before we come into autofocus.
Yeah.
So I hope you enjoyed that video. Don't forget to like it if you enjoyed it, and comment below, give us your thoughts. And don't forget to join us for the next video where we look at the second half of the 80s where autofocus came in with a bang. We'll see you in the next one.